You're listening to The Other 50%, a herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Oliver. Today we are kicking off our series of talking with experts who work in various aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion across industries and in the entertainment industry specifically. First up is Dr. Kira Banks. Dr. Banks' decades of experience allow her to make complex and controversial topics accessible in schools, communities, institutions of higher education, and corporations. She co-founded the Institute for Healing Justice and Equity at St. Louis University, where she is a professor in the Department of Psychology. In addition, she has published over 20 articles in peer-reviewed outlets, and she has contributed to the Harvard Business Review, The Atlantic, and The Guardian. She received her BA from Mount Holyoke College, where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa, and her MA and PhD are from the University of Michigan. Today, Dr. Banks has a podcast, Raising Equity, to support adults in talking to kids about systems of oppression. She is also a co-principal of The Mouse and the Elephant, which develops customized curriculum to meet organizations' long-term needs. On a personal note, I have learned a tremendous amount from Dr. Banks, and I am thrilled she agreed to do this podcast, and I am so excited for you to get to meet her and hear what she has to say. Here, have a listen. Okay, hi, Dr. Kira Banks.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm well, how are you?
I'm doing all right. I am doing all right. That's always a loaded question nowadays, right? And yet,
I know.
I'm hanging in there. Lots of transitions with the kids and work and life. And so I'm trying to be present in the moment and soak it in because things are going to change.
Exactly. These days it's like, well, there's so much really to answer there. So fine. I'm
right.
Fine. Right this second.
Yeah.
So I just want to jump right in. Typically, I just say to people, what do you do to hear where they are, in the business? Because typically I interview women who are in the business. And I know you are a professor, you are in organizations, you do consulting, speaking, writing, you do all the things. But maybe you could describe in your words how you think about what you do.
So broadly, I'm a psychologist. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, which means I do clinical work, but I actually don't have a private practice. I haven't for some years because it takes a lot of time and energy. And I feel like that's, you got to honor your patients and your clients. And so I am a professor where I train other students to be clinicians in our doctoral program. I also teach graduate and undergraduate, and I do research on how discrimination impacts mental health. I also started an Institute for Healing Justice and Equity at St. Louis University with some colleagues that's like across disciplines. So basically, what does it mean for us to think about how we heal from injustices and how do we stop them? So that's been broadly the big part of my work has taken those two tracks. It's one, understanding how do we support people when they're in oppressive systems and environments. And two, how do we stop those environments from being oppressive? Because that would be the easiest way to support people, right?
Right, just knock it off, everybody?
Just stop.
Just stop. And I've seen you work with productions and in entertainment, but you work across all kinds of organizations, don't you?
I do. I work across all sorts of industries.
How do you find the entertainment industry compares across everything else? Like, entertainment is such a weird niche with such a specific culture. Like, how does it compare in the general world?
So in some ways, it's not that different. And I hate to say this because every industry thinks that they're special, but it's similar dynamics. And it's kind of like, everyone's life and lived experience is different. And yet there are some similarities. And so maybe it's the clinical psychologist in me that can see those connections. But I really don't think that the industry is all that different from some of the other industries I've worked in. So for example, it's one of those industries where it's extremely important, like who you know, and to know people to be able to get in. And so that sort of very networked focused. In some ways, nepotism is a really common variable, exists in other industries. The other thing that I'd say that's pretty common in the entertainment industry is this like feeling of being really proud of like the content and creativity and the innovation and of the industry, like to create the content that people watch, that people love, that you can't find in any other industry. However, that sort of like the creativity, the innovation, the pride in the product, that's common across industries. And so in some ways, there's not that much difference, but I will say one of the things that I think is unique, yet also present other places, is that after George Floyd's murder, I saw the biggest increase in wanting to understand what we can do, why this is happening in our industry within the entertainment industry.
Oh, that's interesting because it does feel like there was kind of an uptick in the nation, right? We need to have this conversation. I do think there's something about entertainment at its core. It's very much known for or suspected to be this liberal enclave of people who are trying to tell stories and understand the human condition and make art. At the same time, it's sitting within a really entrenched power system, right? That is kind of at odds with the let's understand the human condition and tell everyone's story and have a really equitable space. So it makes sense to me that people would be really wanting to understand it. So it feels like the last couple of years have really been, like we joked about it, the Hearts and Minds tour, where everyone wants to really talk about it and understand it and dig into what it is and what the stories are.
Yeah, and here's the thing, this is where I think it's common because I see the same sort of dynamic in some of the financial industries I work in, right? You have people who they're not making art in the same way. So they're not creatives in the same way, but they feel like some of them, and especially like in the philanthropy world and the foundation world, like they want to do good. They want to leverage what they have to offer the world to help people, to inspire people, to, right? This kind of very altruistic perspective. And yet there's a lot of racism that's embedded in those systems. The financial system, our philanthropic organizations, our nonprofits, right? And so it's this balance. Actually, Dolly Chugh talked about this in her book, The Person You Mean to Be, that people want to think about themselves as good people, but that if we have oppressive systems happening, you can be a good person inside an oppressive system. Like those things can coexist. And I think what happened post George Floyd is so many people were realizing this is not just about someone being good or bad. There's some patterns happening. And so what I do think was unique, yes, there was an uptick and some people call it a reckoning all across the board. I saw it hit the entertainment industry hard because they saw themselves as such good people. And they were wedded to this idea that we, like you said, we are creatives. We create art for everyone. We see the story in so many people and see the universality of people and story. In the theater world in particular, it's often known as like the place where people who are kind of misfits or, kind of on the fringe might be accepted. And yet they were being told really clearly that they have a problem. And it was this, I do think it hurt them. It hurt their feelings. It hurt their sense of self. It broke up their idea of themselves as good people if the systems that they were creating and recreating and perpetuating were part of the problem, which they have been. But being aware of that, I think that awareness was low, and the ability to see oneself as separate and a good person from the systems, we allowed that because of how we conceptualized the problem. To me, that was the biggest shift post George Floyd, is that everyone had been on a Hearts and Minds tour. And at least from my perspective and the people that I know who are in kind of the equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging, justice world have been clear and remain clear that it is not about hearts and minds, that it is changing the system. It is changing the dynamics. It's changing what I call the built landscape of how we set things up. That's what we need to do, not focus on hearts and minds. And are you a good person or a bad person? Is that person a good person or a bad person? Our focus had been wrong. And in a way, you could say, actually, that focus helped maintain the status quo. Because if we're only worried about who's good or bad, we miss the bigger question around how the water we're swimming in, the way that we set things up is set up to continue to be inequitable. And so I saw that as the biggest shift across industries, but in particular, there was a zest for it within the entertainment industry that had not been there before.
Yeah, I think all of that is true. And it felt like step one was learning the language. like, okay, I'm starting to understand that we're in a system. Also the awareness of that production and entertainment, these are the things that shape the culture at large. And so there is a responsibility to figure it out and to do it right. And so we need to have the language in order to do that, which I think is so much of the learning journey, along with the unlearning of how the industry has been for the last 150 years. What surprised you the most coming into it with entertainment? Was anything like, oh, I didn't expect that?
So I've been doing this work for now, I can say over 25 years, because I used to be like, over 20 years. Now we're here, over 25. Nothing was a huge surprise. So what's also similar is that things move slowly, as much as things can also move quickly when they want to. But things around setting up more equitable, inclusive environments, like there's sometimes either some pushback or some, oh, we're too busy for that. It's hard to fit it in. And so there was a part of me that was going to say the desire to just keep things the way they are and say like, well, but we do such great work. But that is actually, it's not a surprise because I see that across so many different industries of like this feeling that if we critique it too hard, that we're, again, saying that we're bad people or that we did it on purpose. Or that if we are too honest about what's broken, that it'll taint our hundreds of years of history or the accolades that we've gotten. So this like desire to not want to name what's broken and not working, but that's not specific to the industry. What do you think?
On the one hand, as humans, if you have all the evidence in the world that what you have been doing has resulted in success in the accolades and the Emmys and the Oscars and the prizes and the money and all of that, and you have a perception of yourself as being a real good person, it doesn't surprise me at all that people really wanted to talk about it and really wanted to understand it and really wanted to put language around it. And then I've noticed, then when you get to the point of, okay, you get it. You have the words to use now. Now we have a plan of what we can actually do. Suddenly that is really hard and really impossible and really risky. And you don't understand my business and you don't understand what you're asking me to do. And oh my God, we need to talk about it some more.
Yeah, because we don't want to let go of the way things are. And that's why I say it didn't feel that different, because basically the journey started with people wanting to be heard. So Black folks in particular, folks of color, were like, we just told you what was going on last week, last month, last year in that climate survey or that focus group. But for some reason, you're willing to listen more now. And so we'll tell you again. Some were like, forget you. You're not serious. You're just saying that you're just performative, right? But those who were willing to engage in that moment were like, okay, we'll tell you for the 100th time what the problem is. And then it really was a matter of like, all right, so what are you going to do about it? So your comment around like having actions match words, it's a big one. And yet that is not industry specific. And so there's this push and pull. Like, I think that's part of why I was able to step into the consultative role with different media organizations and Broadway productions, because I've seen this process of like awakening, awareness, understanding, analysis, and then working to create some new behaviors and action. I've seen it across so many different sectors that what was clear is that, now don't get me wrong, there have been people who've been doing this work in the industry for decades, right? Like there are folks who have been veterans. And there was this moment, this window where people were willing to do some deeper analysis. And like you said, some folks were even willing and able to get to a plan of action. But then you've got to do things differently. And if they've had success monetarily and in terms of like accolades in the industry in the past, they're thinking, why do I need to change anything? They're really like, even though they're hearing the stories anew, they don't realize the cost. But I think about what's happening in East Palestine, Ohio right now, right? With the chemical explosion and the spill, and how, we can talk about how we care about humans and we care about people. But then if this major humanitarian event is happening and we're not making sure people are being evacuated or getting clean water to not just drink, but bathe themselves in, right? Our actions don't match our words. Or when we hear the young woman who was in the Sandy Hook shooting and in the Michigan State shooting. And she's like, all right, enough already. This is my second mass shooting. I literally have physical and psychological injuries. Can we stop with the thoughts and prayers? Can we do something? It almost feels like we're not tired enough yet. We're not willing to do something different to get a different outcome. But we want to say that we care about people, or we want to say that right? But we're still able to make money, insert company industry that's still making money despite these massive events where people are harmed, or we're still willing to tolerate, not having legislation that prevents the sort of mass shootings that we continuously see. So I don't know if you see a connection there, but I really do think about how we're saying one thing, but it's hard to do another. And so in that way, the entertainment industry is just like any other space.
We're also sitting in this culture, which I think is particularly American, where our policies are definitely not people first in healthcare, in business, in environmental. It's not people first. And there are other places I've traveled to recently where it did seem people first. I was like, what a refreshing difference. And you're not crazy for thinking the people should be thought about here. But I think sitting in that context is really hard. And if you're in an industry that's been so successful, I don't know how much people believe the business case that you're going to be even more successful. I think more people are afraid of, well, I'm going to get canceled, or I'm going to have a big scandal around myself if I don't sort this out, or I need to do enough not to be on anybody's radar. I think there's much more fear-driven rather than a real belief. I mean, there's a whole spectrum, as you know, in entertainment. There's people who have been doing the work for 20 years and what took everybody so long, and this is just how I operate, and I'm going to continue to operate that way. On the other end is, you don't know what you're talking about. You're introducing risk. There are no people who can do this work except me and my bros. And, there's everybody in between. And so even when very successful people are saying, not only are you going to be more successful if you do this work, but you're also not going to continue to be successful without doing this work, I don't know if people totally believe it yet until they've had some experience of not being successful.
Yeah. And I mean, you named it, like the way that we've set up our system with capitalism inherently, it's not people first. And so we shouldn't really be surprised that we're not thinking about people. And yet there was that window where we were all at home, not all, I should not say that at all. That's a very privileged perspective, where many of us were at home and had the time and space and attention to focus on this murder. And we realized what's happening, and it's not that what's not an anomaly. And so that, to me, reminds me how connected we are as humans. And yet we have quickly gotten back to business as usual.
So I want to dig into all the different pieces before we go to the where do we go from here. Because I know one of the things that, certainly working with people who work in production, producers, and the type of people who are running the business of production, very much action-oriented. Let me get through my checklist. I'm going to do a million things. If you want this DEI stuff on my list, fine. Put it on my list and I'll do it. The thing they want to do is very quickly hire a bunch of people that check all the boxes so they can say, look, I did it. I have a diverse crew set, without necessarily wanting to do the other work around it. And I love the way that you talk about it in a way that it's so much more nuanced than that. And you have to do so much more work rather than just hire people and shove them into the system that's kind of terrible for all kinds of people.
I mean, it really just doesn't solve the larger issue, right? So representation is a thing. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. You see people wear shirts, representation matters. Absolutely. Not arguing that. And you can bring people in, and if you don't allow them to share their lived experience or their perspective, you actually don't benefit from them being in the room and being representative. You haven't let them fully be represented. You just have checked the box that they exist in the space. And so that's why it's so much more than that. If we even think about it, you can think about it from a few different perspectives, but right, I have one of my consulting firms is the mouse and the elephant. And we often use that analogy to help people think about if the elephants are running things, because they're elephants, they get to take up space, right? And they're like, sure, mice, come on in, but shift nothing. Can the mice really access anything in this elephant world? oh, but we let you in, but yeah, you're like trampling me and I can't reach anything and nothing is sized right for me. And they're like, oh, well, stop complaining. We let you in.
Yeah.
Right. It's like this whole thing around like understanding that representation is the beginning and actually sometimes isn't the first thing that needs to happen. Like, first, you got to reflect on how is this environment shaped? Who is it benefiting? Who is it set up for? Are we ready to say that we want to be and can be inclusive of other ways of being? And then if we are, then bring people in, because otherwise it becomes a revolving door. And you get to say, oh, well, we had someone who was a woman in this department and they just didn't work. Well, like, yeah, because between the jokes that you made and the places where you went to like build team culture, she didn't want to go. She didn't want to stay. So it's not really on her. You didn't have to suffer and do things that were outside of, your comfort zone to like live here in this space. And so why do we expect that folks who are in those kind of mice positions have to like change themselves and assimilate to succeed, rather than thinking about how we really can make this a place that multiple people have access to opportunities and development opportunities?
I think that is the shift that's blindsiding a lot of people, because there's a whole generation who came through and I paid my dues. I shut up. I listened. I figured it out. I didn't ask for anything until I got to the top, and now it's my turn to treat everybody behind me horribly also. At the same time, we're having this racial equity conversation. There's also a generational shift happening where Gen Z and millennials are coming in and they're really not having it. So the whole kind of militaristic top-down direction and control culture that production has had forever is also being asked to change at the same time. I think it all works together, and if we can do it, what a world this will be. But I think it's addressing all the parts about the culture in general in production.
Yeah, because it's not just about race. It's not just about gender. It's not even just about class or status. It's about all of those things. It's about seeing the humanity in people. I was just actually, I think I was listening to a study that was talking about, like a news study that was talking about how, the generational differences, because sometimes we overblow generational differences. They get overblown, like, oh, okay, boomer or Gen X, right? But what is different is that, like, historically, when boomers and other folks were growing up, like, they might be able to live on the wage that they were getting doing whatever in a production, even with a union or not, but that they were able to like make do. So that whole thing of like, I did my job, I shut up, I put my head down. Nowadays, there was a study that was saying, like, if you took the salary of what someone was making like in the 80s, because they're like, well, I bought a house and I was able to do whatever, and you took it to today, it's like $115 an hour that people would have to make, something egregious like that. And so, like, we shouldn't be surprised in the system that we have that, no, they're not willing to just shut up and take it because they got to work 5 other jobs to live. So it's not just about them being entitled, it's them trying to have a life and to be valued as a human being. And so I think, to your point, one of the things we try to articulate is that, yes, racial equity is important and we often sidestep the conversation and don't want to talk about race. But this is about like seeing the humanity in people, period. And it's not always just about race. It often isn't, because someone who has a race also has a gender, sexual orientation, a class background, a religious background, and all of those things matter. So this whole idea that like, well, I just put my head down and, it was okay. Those were pretty homogenous workplaces. And it was a different society in terms of like what you needed to live.
Yeah, that reminds me of when people now are saying, well, I worked my way through college bussing tables. Like, what's the problem with kids these days? Like, the problem with kids, tuition's $80,000 a year. What are you talking about?
Right? And again, this is why people have to understand the built landscape and how we set things up. As a country, we have in a way created this and allowed the expansion of loans that allow people, I shouldn't even say allow, but give people access to college, but at the same time hamper them with debt. So it's like this double-edged thing. And so, yeah, you worked your way through college, but like you said, college was not as expensive. I had a colleague once say that was the next bubble that was going to burst, like when we had the housing bubble burst, and was it like early 2000s, oh nine or something like that. But it never did. It just keeps expanding. So expensive.
It's unbelievable. I mean, sidebar, I have one daughter who's graduating college this year. And when she was applying, we sat down with a financial aid officer at some college and we were looking at the whole thing. And I said, are you really encouraging 17-year-olds to acquire $250,000 of debt? And he was like, yeah. I was like, you're insane. It's not. Anyway, I could go on about our inequitable college system for hours. I'm sure you can too. You're right in the middle of it too, right?
Yes, we are. But that I think is connected to the industry in that what I learned. Okay, you asked what surprised me. I didn't realize how many people were either unpaid or like barely paid.
Yeah.
Like to get an opportunity to even have proximity, whether it was a production assistant or an intern, whatever it was called. I didn't realize how many people were like just there to like say that they were there because it mattered so much that you were there and a part of that production or next to this person. And oh my goodness, to live in LA or New York or wherever the shoot is happening and have the money to like do that or to take out the loans to do that on either nothing or so little, that did surprise me. I was like, what are we doing?
What are we doing? And then there's all the blowback about Nepo babies. It's like, what do you expect?
About what?
Nepo babies.
People who are born because of nepotism or like they got the job because of it?
People who got the job. Like there's so many actors that you don't realize are the children of famous actors. And now everybody's being revealed and they're calling them the Nepo babies. Like the worked so hard to get where they are and then you realize, their dad is a famous movie star. They may have had a leg up.
Right. So that I take that back. That surprised me. I was very surprised at how many positions were available like that. And they're like, oh yeah, you can just, we'll take an intern. I'm like, well, okay, so how are they going to pay for their food, their lodging, their transportation? So we're perpetuating this inequity because you can only do that if you can afford it.
They even passed a law in California, you can't have unpaid internships and people still do it.
Really?
There are companies that run on paying people $50 a day.
What?
Until they work their way up.
I don't know why I'm whispering, but that's egregious.
Because it's shocking.
Oh my goodness.
Well, yeah, why are you going to give up your very cheaper free labor of kids who are super eager and it's their dream and they're going to work really hard?
So rather than me trying to convince someone that is inhumane, because I get that not everyone sees it as that. They talk about that's how they came up, all those arguments. How about we just need people who are in positions of power to say, like, we're not doing that anymore. So whether it's through following the legislation at the state level or through enacting something, I'm talking to people who have some power just to be like, if you really think that's awful and you're in a position to make sure that internships get subsidized or people get paid a living wage, whatever that living wage is for your city, not just a generic living wage, make it happen, make it a policy. People aren't going to be happy, but that can be your legacy rather than sitting around being like, oh, that we shouldn't do that. That's unfortunate that that's the way it is. Do something.
Make it happen. Well, and the funny thing is that in pockets, people have done something. Powerful people have said, we're going to pay PAs a decent wage. We're going to pay the interns. We're going to pay them, double what they used to make. The budgets don't collapse. The show doesn't collapse. It's fine. Like it can so be done. It's not, if what you're saving on not paying the least paid people a little bit more, if that's going to crash your whole thing, then there's something really unstable about it. It's one of the myths, actually.
Yes.
Which leads us to the other myths. Because I know that we talk about myths all the time, and that's what people come back with in the arguments of, we can't do this work because, or of course I want to, but things like it's a merit-based system, and you have to work very hard, and you can't ask me to hire people who are unqualified because I have to hire the most qualified people in the world. The fact that they all look exactly like me, I can't help that, but I'm hiring solely based on merit. What do you say to that?
I'd say oftentimes that's not the case. Like when you dig, it's often because someone knows someone or because someone went to the particular college that you have a pipeline from. And so, they're meritorious people that didn't go to like one of two schools. I'm not going to knock the schools because it's not the school's fault, but right. Like we end up privileging people from certain institutions. We end up privileging people who know someone who knows someone. And so what it is that you feel like it's a known quantity. and that it's not a risk, right? So I think I would push people to be more honest with what they're saying, that you can't necessarily say you're hiring the best. It's you're hiring what feels most comfortable to you. And oftentimes it's because, oh, I know someone who came from that program, or I know someone who worked with that person. And so that can be part of what's in the mix. But also, you also have to think about like what's the heterogeneity on your team, and not just in terms of race even, but like experience. Because if you have a homogenous team in any way, like what's the use? If everyone's the same, comes from the same school with the same background, out of the same, oh, it's really going to be easy for you to lead that team and make them do what you want them to do because they think the same as you, then I challenge that you're really trying to be innovative and creative. And if you can own that, yeah, I'm not, I just want to be safe and not take risks and,
and fast
and
don't forget fast.
Right. And do what I want to do, at least be honest about it.
John Amici posted something the other day on Twitter when he's called in to consult with a business or a board or something. Did you see this one? Where if he looks around and the board all looks exactly the same, he'll be like, what are the chances that the best brains in this industry all come in a guy that looks exactly like you? That's amazing. The odds.
Right. And so then that really pushes people to think about like, what is it that's making me not be able to see talent that comes in a different package? And that's where I really push folks. I'm all about systems perspective, but when I work with folks who are in leadership positions, I really push them thinking about their own background, their own identities, their own stuff, where they were educated, what they value, because what we don't often realize is how we perpetuate that in our choices. That it's not always that we're against someone who's different from us. It's often that we're just a big cheerleader for people who are like us because it's a known quantity. They're in our group.
I also wonder if there's any subconscious fear around if it's not actually a merit-based system and I'm in this position of power, what does that say about me? Like, does that rock people's worlds a little bit?
Probably.
I don't know.
Probably. And then we get defensive and we're like, but of course I deserve to belong here, right? Right. So then, yeah, I mean, for some people, I think that is what's at play. Like, and that's where I say, this is not the move to think about equity and inclusion is not saying, we don't need any more white men.
No,
it's not what it's about. Like that, right. There are plenty of white men and there will continue to be. It's a matter of limiting our view of what's possible, what's talented, what's leadership potential to only being white men. And so, yeah, in a way, that's more competition, quote unquote competition. But if we're serious about access and opportunity, then that's what we need to be thinking about, like not looking at the same package, whether it's race or gender or sexual orientation or religion, background, pedigree, all of that. And I think there's power in that, and just realizing that we want to think about how would I say this? I think too often people get defensive personally and they think about like, what will I lose? Rather than a perspective of, if I create an environment and a space where everyone has access and opportunity, it's actually a safer place for all of us.
Yeah. It's the getting them to that point, I think, is the trick.
Yeah, it's almost, and I use this example a lot in my trainings, but like I work at an institution that's over 200 years old. It's a Catholic institution. It's not trying to not be Catholic, but it does realize that to stay relevant, it has to be inclusive of other religions and faith traditions, right? And so it's not like throwing away its Catholicness. It's how does it intentionally include other faith traditions? And so in that same way, it's not about like saying, oh, there's so many white men, so let's not include them. No, it's like, that's the dominant culture here. How do we intentionally include other identities, other races, genders, sexual orientations, religions, disabilities? And so I do think people get it wrong. They get defensive and they get a scarcity mentality rather than...
It's a scarcity, I was just going to say, that there's not enough room for everybody. Like in the biggest production boom we've ever had, that there's not enough room when you're desperate. This is what I always get on. You're desperate to find an accountant because there aren't any. To still have that scarcity mindset is such a weird thing to be holding on to. I think the other thing One of the other myths is that I would love to hire more Black people, more women, more people with disability. None of them exist. So they haven't been in the industry. They don't have any experience. Therefore, you're asking me to hire unqualified people and introduce a bunch of risk to my production. Those are kind of two myths smashed together, but they're often said in the same breath. What do you say to that?
They exist. You're just not looking in the right place. They're just not in your circle.
Yeah, you just don't know them.
You just don't know them. The number might be smaller, probably, just because like proportionally. So let's take Black folks. We're like, what, 13% of the population? Don't know my latest census data. And in terms of like my field as a professor, we're 4% of the professoriate. So do we exist? Yeah. But numerically, there just aren't as many of us because we are a smaller number of the percent of the population. And then of that population, a very small percentage of us are in the academy, similar to the industry. And this is where I say, like, there's so many similarities because, yeah, the base number is small. The base rate's small. There are probably very few production accountants of color, but I bet you they exist. And if they don't, I bet you there's some really top-notch accountants that are of color that might want to make the leap into the production world. And so then that's where they say, oh, well, they're unqualified. Well, it's like, yeah. But if you're desperate for an accountant, who are you going to hire? Someone who's like, you weren't going to get the person who like is the top of the top because you're scrambling for an accountant. So if you have someone who is a good accountant and has the interest to get into the industry, that's not someone who's unqualified. That's just someone who hasn't had a door open in the industry.
I also like how you talk about the risk of it all.
Well, before I get to the risk of it all, you asked that question around like, where are they? I also think we have to look at the tendency to push folks of color in particular into niche productions.
Yeah.
Right? So, I mean, it's part of why like the Tyler Perrys of the world, I know there's only one Tyler Perry, but just work with me,
Yeah.
Folks like that who have like started their own production companies or started their own, like because they kept getting overlooked, right? And often we're only seen in a very narrow way. And so they weren't getting the experiences, the opportunities, getting to tell the stories that they wanted. And so when we have folks who are folks of color and we assume that they can only work on that show that it's about folks of color, but if we look at the like universe of shows, that is only a small, very small piece of the pie, then we have actually created the problem that we don't have enough folks of color to go around in a sense. That sounds very tokenizing and commoditizing, but like this idea that we are in the industry might be perpetuating the problem because we don't see, let's put them on some mainstream show. We're like, well, let's put them in this niche show. Well, so then they don't have the same experience. And so then you want to compare them and say, oh, well, yeah, they haven't dealt with as big of a budget. Again, because access and opportunity doors were not open.
Yeah, it's like looking at white and male as, I mean, it's the same with anything. Looking at the white male as the standard human, everyone else is other. Oh, a white costumer can work on any particular type of show. The Black costumer has to work on the Black show. The woman can write the story as long as it's about her personal trauma, or a woman can direct it, but it better be a love story. Like those myths that I think perpetuate and limit opportunity. Whereas why can't a costumer work on any show there is, regardless of who they are?
But that, I think, when we think about like the risk, sometimes I push back to say, well, is it really a risk? Right? So if we look at this person's experience, is it really a risk? Or are we just framing it as such because they had the opportunity to work on this niche show rather than this bigger show. So if you're giving this opportunity to work with this bigger show, they have the skills.
And they've done it for less money.
Right?
So now if they're getting more money, more support, a bigger department, chances are they're going to be fine.
And let's be real, like we take a risk anytime we hire someone. It's a risk. It's an unknown quantity in a sense. But this is why people like to take their entourage everywhere with them, because it's not a risk and it's a known quantity. Right. So I get it. And especially in the industry, if it's a formula and it's worked, why mess with it? And so that's where like things get very closed and insular.
Yeah, it's hard to break that up. But the funny thing is it takes one job where someone's worked with someone new, and then that's their person.
Right.
And then they'll be happy to take that person from job to job to job to job.
Yeah.
So it's really a matter of getting people in the door to be considered, along with all the other things. I know part of that getting people in the door that we get a lot of pushback on is people being scared about the language and how they talk about things. And how do we talk about race? How do we talk about LGBTQ? Like we've heard, for people's entire careers, they've been told in hiring to not ask certain questions, not name things, be colorblind. Let's talk about that. And now as a result of all these conversations, we're asking people to be very intentional and deliberate and really intentional about who they're bringing in as candidates, who they're looking at, who they're hiring. And it's making people very nervous from a legal perspective. How do we get people kind of through that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should not be framing this as you need to hire Black people. Like it shouldn't be a quota. We shouldn't see things from that perspective. That's not useful. It actually doesn't work and it's unconstitutional, right? Like we don't have to have that argument.
All the things.
People talk about, oh, well, just make sure you interview a certain number of women or folks of color, like the Rooney Rule. Has not led to an increase in Black coaches and coaches of color. Like it doesn't work in that way. Like, so it's not as easy to just say, oh, hire people of those racial and ethnic groups. And so I guess I would just name that people can stop being scared of that because like that should never be the way you do it. And if that's the way you're doing it, it's problematic.
Yeah.
And I do think that this idea that you want to be conscious of your pool, though, is an important one. And so you want to think about, how do I cast the widest net? How do I maybe look at Hispanic serving institutions, historically Black colleges, like not just go to the colleges that I usually go to recruit, or not just look at the programs and the film schools that I usually look to see on a resume, but expand your network, expand your knowledge of who's producing folks from different backgrounds that are in the industry, and have an expansive as enough pool as possible. So that then even if you don't end up hiring someone from a group that's historically underrepresented, you've now at least met them, or they're on your roster for people to maybe reach out to, right? And so I do think it's important to not fall into this mindset that's like defensive of like, well, I can't just hire someone because they're Black. Exactly. No one's asked you to do that. That's not what we're asking you to do.
You got it.
We're asking you to be expansive in your network and the pool that you hire from, to increase the possibility that you will become familiar with and potentially hire someone who's from a group that's underrepresented. And to check yourself on the cultural narratives that you maybe have created about people who aren't from your group, or people who are from a particular background. So some of that is individual work on you not getting caught up in people from this school aren't capable. Was that really true? Or are you just valuing the school that you went to? Right? Or, that you can't see the value in maybe some of the more niche cultural shows, but it's like, wait, aren't those the same camera grip production skills that they're using, they used over here? Aren't those the same ones they're using here? So why have that sort of bias? So there is some self-reflection that needs to happen, but you also need to do the work of expanding your network and building a broader pool.
I mean, that is a full-time job that everyone needs to be engaged in all the time.
Yep.
Could we just talk about language and words for a minute? If you could just give us quick definitions: equity, inclusion, diversity, built landscape. With the exception of built landscape, I hear people using those first three interchangeably as if they mean the same thing. They're just popping them into sentences. If you could define them for us.
Yeah. So I would start with diversity is something we all have. It's those different aspects of who we are, our social identities that shape our experiences in the world. And they are not simply race or gender or sexual orientation and those groups that are underrepresented. So I hear people talk about diversity and say, oh, diverse hire. It's like, well, what do you mean? Oh, I mean, we need more women, or we need more people of color. Well, that's not a diverse hire. That's a hire, and you're going to be thoughtful about groups that have been underrepresented and make sure they're in your pool. But diversity is just gender identity, sexual orientation, veteran status, being neurodivergent, being a parent or a caregiver. Those are all things we all have. And inclusion is including people on the basis of those differences, celebrating them rather than telling people to leave them at the door and minimizing them. So thinking about how you create an environment that gives people not only a sense of I can be who I am, but also you belong here. Equity is about access, opportunity, advancement, and having the opportunity in a space and having those barriers that are there that keep people from having access and opportunity removed, right? And so that is about when people say diverse hires, typically they mean there's a group that's underrepresented because there have been barriers, and we need to make sure that we remove those barriers, or we're cognizant of helping people navigate those barriers. That's really equity. And then built landscape is a concept that I've used to help people understand how systems and inequities work. It's like the way that things are set up and built around us. So whether it's like the parks in our neighborhood, the highway system, the skyscrapers, like what have we built up and set up around us that has shaped our experiences that I might be bumping into that you might not, that shape the opportunities and access that we have.
Thank you. I feel like I just asked you to run through your greatest hits, but I want to get them there on the record. I've heard you say, and if you just want to refer people to your podcast, Raising Equity, feel free. I've heard you say you can't nice your way out of racism. And I think that's so true. And I think it's where a lot of well-meaning people go and think that that's how it can be fixed. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that goes back to this whole idea of we can't lean on being good people to fix inequities. And so, for example, like if we know that the way that our school systems are set up are not fair, that kids who are living in neighborhoods where the houses aren't worth as much, that their schools don't have enough resources, and that places where people can afford to send their kids to parochial or private schools know that they are doing that to opt out of the public system because the public system is lacking, right? If we see that, us being nice and kind to those kids does nothing. They're still without resources. They're still without the books that they need or the technology that they need to make them competitive in this world. And so I say we can't nice our way out of racism because being nice is not the solution. We can all be nice people in a very unfair and unjust society. And that's useless, really. I mean, I guess it's good to be, I'm not saying we shouldn't be kind to each other, but in terms of really changing things so that those kids have resources, our niceness doesn't do anything unless we use it to leverage our privilege and what we have to make sure that they do have what they need to change how we're funding the schools or to resource the schools. That sort of action matters, not whether we're nice or not.
You need to actually change the system.
Yeah, right. I don't need you to like me. I just need you to make sure that I have access and an opportunity. It doesn't mean we'll have the same outcome, but it does mean that we've created an environment where people experience the ability to step forward and to have the opportunities and to thrive.
Going back to production and what we think will actually make sustainable change. I've heard you talk about, it's not one and done. A lot of times we think we can fly in, do a workshop like a sexual harassment, where the way the sexual harassment workshop has not eliminated sexual harassment in any way, shape, or form. What do you think that work actually needs to look like on productions in a sustained way?
Yeah, it needs to be embedded in every step of the production. So it doesn't hurt to have a training or some sort of professional development workshop for folks, but it needs to be woven throughout. So for as simple as like if we think about honoring people in terms of their gender identity and their pronouns, right? I can have a workshop where we talk about, we respect people's pronouns, but what do we do on set, on production? When we have a call sheet, do we have an opportunity for people to have their pronouns there so that everyone is able to share them? Or do we only have that for people who identify as them, they, and they have to figure out a way to out themselves as them, they, or they have to write it in. And so those are the only pronouns. And so we're over focusing on folks who are in non-dominant groups and putting the burden on them to say something, right? So it looks like figuring out a way to integrate the work into how you do production and not siloing it or make it in name only.
I think that's what may be surprising to people. Because that example that you just brought up, pronouns, easy fix. Ask people their pronouns as they're coming in. Whoever wants to give them. Put them on a call sheet. Done. That's taken you 10 seconds to create an environment where people may feel more comfortable.
But that means we have to slow down to do something different. And we're creatures of habit.
Yeah, because I don't... You don't have to slow down that much.
I agree.
It's not that hard. I'm going to argue it's not that hard all day long to people. And we'll be shouting that chorus from the rooftops. When I think about like reality television or unscripted television, and a lot of times part of the show is like the conflict, right? And the drama and the people saying terrible things to each other and that escalating. And there's also a push in the industry in general to start having, it's like the last frontier, to start having HR people, on productions and on sets. And so people are lodging a lot of complaints. And at the same time, I think sometimes in these shows, they're very committed to the content because the content is getting clicks and getting ratings and getting everybody talking. And so it feels really hard to get in there and make really any kind of progress with the work if the content is so committed to be inflammatory.
So I think this takes producers that are willing to see the bigger picture, because what typically happens on these shows is that someone will dig up information on someone and then they're like, why didn't you know this? Or why didn't you deal with this? And then they have to confront or say something on social media or say something in a group setting when people come back for a reunion style show or something like that. And I think, well, like, why not be proactive and incorporate those sorts of content pieces into the storyline? That then saves you the backlash from your viewers. Not that they might not dig up something you don't know about, but at least you're in conversation about the topic before people dig it up and you don't look as complicit in hiding it. Like, we've seen this before. This is not a surprise.
So many times.
That people are going to pull up skeletons in folks' closet. So let's just pull them out before they get found.
Wouldn't it be interesting? I've always thought, like, can we watch that person's journey? They've gone away for 6 months. They've come back. They've said, oh, I'm doing the work, whatever that means. I'm listening to podcasts. I'd love to watch that journey. Like, I'd love to watch them have the conversation, to work with you and like go through the process and hear the thinking and hear, I would love it. So here's our pitch.
I think it'd be super fun. I think people would say, oh, no one would watch that. People watch those shows to be entertained, not to be schooled.
Have you seen Queer Eye in the new iteration of it? People would eat it up.
I think so too. So it's really a matter of someone being innovative enough and forward thinking enough.
Okay, producers.
And someone willing to take a risk, right? I've talked to some producers who say they're in, who are like, so we'll see. Time will tell.
Good. All right. Well, I'm here for it.
Me too.
Okay, this is really my last question, unless there are questions I did not ask you that I should have asked you. But what gives you hope during this time? What keeps you going?
So one of my mentors, Beverly Daniel Tatum, reminds us that hope is a discipline, that it's not just something we have, that we have to practice it. And so I remember that because I don't expect hope to just be there. Like, I've got to practice it. I've got to engage it. And so what gives me hope is that there are still people who are interested in thinking deeply about this work. So we know that, like, the numbers in terms of jobs, DEI positions have been laid off at higher rates than other positions. So we know that we're almost 3 years post George Floyd's murder, that these things ebb and flow. I'm not surprised. History, psychology, sociology all tell us that things will ebb and flow, and that at other moments in our history, when we had great progress, we also saw great backlash. And so what gives me hope is that we have opened the doors, pushed things further than they were in the past, and that I see people who are trying to not let the doors close as far. So yes, folks are not like, my phone is not ringing off the hook the way that it was in the summer of 2020, but it's still ringing. And I think that's because there's a snowball of folks who are like, oh, this isn't just about unconscious bias training. This isn't just about being nice. Like, this is bigger work, kind of like leadership development is big work, kind of like management skills is big work. And so I see people continuing to invest in the work. I continue to get calls about whether it's professional development or strategic consulting, or I kind of joke, I have an Olivia Pope arm of my work where it's like clean up on aisle, whatever, like make this mess go away, scandal sort of stuff. So I'm getting all of those types of calls, which means even though it's not the fad in a way that it was, and that people have jumped off the bandwagon and there has been backlash that has made some people clam up, that there's some who are willing to work through it. And to me, that gives me hope. And I'm actually working on a talk that is about that, like how to commit to this work in the midst of backlash, or how to keep moving even when it's not popular. So those glimmers give me hope.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Dr. Kira Banks, thank you so much for being on the other 50%. How do people find you, and where should they be following you?
You can find me on all the socials. I'm Dr. Kira Banks across all the platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I'm probably forgetting something, TikTok, right? You can also find me at my website at kirabanks.com. Yeah, no doctor there.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. It was good to chat with you.
You've been listening to The Other 50%, A Herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Oliver. Thank you to Dr. Kira Banks for sharing her expertise. You should immediately go and subscribe to Raising Equity and follow her on social media. And special thanks to Jay Rowe, Danny Rossner, and Allison McQuaid for the music. Go check out the Catch a Break podcast, the insider's guide to breaking into and navigating the entertainment industry. Thanks for listening. See you next time.